Hi, everyone. Michael Cavaccini, and today I have an interview with someone I admire a great deal, Mick Garris. Mick is a producer, director, screenwriter, and novelist specializing in the horror genre. Mick has been tied to so many great creative people over the years. He himself is an amazing creator, which we'll dive into all the different interesting aspects of his legendary career. And I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you, Mick, for joining me today.
Well, Michael, it's great to be here. I really appreciate it and look forward to having a great chat.
Absolutely. So, my background is I went to Temple University and studied public relations. And I see that you started off in the film industry doing publicity. So, tell me about that experience and what that was like for you and kind of those lessons that you learned while doing that that were applicable later on.
Well, the main thing that happened with publicity, doing film publicity, was I don't think I was very good at it, for one thing, but it brought me into an industry that I'd loved all my life and never imagined I could be a part of. And so I would do press kits and electronic press kits and interview filmmakers and the performers within the films, some of whom I'd met as a journalist myself before I did publicity. And it really gave me access to people whom I admired and was able to talk to people that I represented or were a part of films that I was working on doing publicity. I also hired myself because I specialized in the horror and fantasy genre at a time where nobody else was doing that. I would hire myself to do making of documentaries. And so I learned how to put pieces of film together to make a narrative, which was something I'd never done before. And nobody was going to hire me to do that, but I did under my own auspices. And it just led to me learning a lot about the people who do this and learning that you don't learn much about the making of movies by being on a set, because most of it happens before the films are being made.
Absolutely. And so you got to work doing PR for, I mean, we're talking some heavy hitters, right? I mean, Star Wars being one of them. I mean, for you, what are the most memorable films that you had the opportunity to promote? And you're talking about kind of connecting with other like-minded creative people. Any conversations you had with creative folks during those times that really resonated with you?
Well, first of all, John Landis, when I was working on Star Wars, the film had already been made, and I was answering phones for Star Wars Corp, which was mostly their marketing and publicity. But John Landis was in the office next door to mine prepping Animal House. And that's where we met and became friends. And then I went to Avco Embassy to do specialized genre publicity while they were making The Howling and Scanners and Escape from New York. And so I got to know Joe Dante and John Carpenter and David Cronenberg and all these people who remain friends to this day and colleagues, people I worked with. And sometimes I was able to hire them for Masters of Horror years later, where they would direct episodes of the show I'd created. So those were people who were the beginning of my career and remain in my life as friends and creative partners at times. So yeah, it was a very great, explosive time for the horror genre back in the early 80s. All of this stuff was happening where these filmmakers were kind of having their start in the independent world and being around. The first time I met John Carpenter, I was interviewing him in a tiny little recording studio in Hollywood where it was just he and his synthesizer, and he was creating music for this movie he made called Halloween. And who knew that I was in the middle of history being made right there? I'm the Zelig of horror. I'm the little out of focus guy in the background of the picture of all the famous people doing outrageously wonderful work.
That's incredible. I had the opportunity to interview Stephen Bishop a couple times, and one of those times he talked about Animal House. He was got
Yeah, I gave my love a cherry. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he said he still has the guitar from that. He's one of the people who's like kind of like He's kept all the things over the years, all his crazy outfits and everything, and wild, glasses and stuff. But really nice guy. And yeah, so
He
you're
came
talking.
from San Diego at a time when I was living in San Diego. I was in a band at the same time. He was performing in San Diego then. So we have that shared background as well.
Yeah, he's a great songwriter and singer. Just some incredible music. And actually, speaking of music, since we just touched on it, has music been a constant throughout your whole life, or was there a time in your career where you said, "Hey, this is what I'm gonna try and be a musician," or was it always for you just kind of just something that you did on the side because you're passionate about it?
No, I was really dedicated to Horse Feathers, the band I was in for 7 years. I was writing during that time, but never selling anything, and was completely invisible in the world of film and television. But that was a real commitment. We really thought we were going to make our lives as this. We had a lot of success in all but financial ways. We performed a lot in San Diego, then we moved to LA and we opened for acts like the Kinks and Foghat and Renaissance and people like that. But we thought that was going to be it. But all during that time, I loved movies and was writing spec scripts that nobody ever read, nobody ever saw, until I finally made the connection with Steven Spielberg when I was doing publicity on doing the making of The Goonies, and that kind of changed the direction of my life.
Mm. Any musicians who really inspired you, either from a vocal standpoint or just playing guitar? Anyone who you're like, man, if I could only sing like them, if I could only play an instrument like them.
Well, we were a progressive rock band, but with a sense of humor. Most progressive rock bands are pretty direly serious. But I was completely inspired. Well, of course, the Beatles. I was in junior high when the Beatles happened, and they changed the world, not just musically, but socially and politically, and in so many ways. And what greater singer in the world is there than Paul McCartney or John Lennon? So those were early influences, but they influenced everybody. But by the time I was in a band, there were bands like Gentle Giant or Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes, who were very adventurous, both vocally and instrumentally. I was never a good instrumentalist, but I was the lead vocalist in the band. So I was always inspired by the people who went beyond the 3-chord progressions, by the imaginative music that was more like modern classical music, but played with rock and roll instruments, guitars and bass and keyboards and synthesizers and vocal pyrotechnics and all of those things. So those were the ones that inspired me the most. But I loved Badfinger. I loved Roy Wood and The Move. I loved Electric Light Orchestra. And mostly my tastes were English, because most of the progressive rock stuff came out of the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you point that out. I love music where you can hear the layers in it, where
Yeah,
you can listen to it many times and notice how the piano and the guitar weave together. What are you holding up there?
that's the Horse Feathers CD.
Oh, look at that. So where can people get this?
Go to horsefeathersmusic.com. It's a bunch of demos that we took from our work in the 70s. And a couple years ago, we got together and we chose what songs in what order, and we overlaid instrumental tracks and vocal tracks and put out our first ever CD 50 years after the band formed.
Wow. Well, it's never too late, right, to fulfill a dream. I mean, that's fantastic. I
Yeah.
know that from my communication with you that Barry Manilow is a huge influence on me. Do you have any connections to Barry, or did you ever see him perform live? I think he's just incredible and a heck of a arranger, producer, and performer.
Yeah, no, I've never seen him, but yeah, I agree with you in about his many talents. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the types of like when I hear like Meatloaf and Jim Steinman, right? His productions with the key changes and it was like a mini opera every song. And I think that
Well,
music like that.
Meatloaf, I did meet because he starred in one of the episodes of Masters of Horror, Dario
Oh,
Argento's second episode. Yeah.
Well, I know we're jumping ahead in time, but tell me about that. What was that like?
It was amazing. I mean, first of all, Dario Argento, I'm producing something he's directing. How fucking awesome is that? Um, and and Meatloaf was not a horror fan, and it kind of freaked him out a little bit, and he gets skinned at the end of the show. And so he was not used to all the makeup effects that K&B did for us and all. But Dario is a very specific and personal filmmaker. So watching him at work, watching a master at work, and this was his second episode. He'd done one in the first season as well. And it was amazing to see Meatloaf working as an actor. It was the first time I'd ever seen him like everybody else was in Rocky Horror Picture Show, even before the albums came out. But he was a really nice guy, really got along with everybody, and was very cooperative with Dario and very respectful of somebody who earned everybody's respect. And everybody was incredibly respectful of Meatloaf. And you haven't lived until you've seen a skinned meatloaf on the set.
Wow, that sounds like a recipe I don't want to cook. Yeah, I had the chance to meet Meatloaf a few years ago before his passing, and he talked to me for so long. It was at Monster Mania in Cherry Hill, sitting at his table, and he keeps talking and talking and talking to me. And he's got a long line. Thinking these people are probably getting pissed off at me. But I was like, he was so generous with his time and just answering questions and just really nice person. So
He's
yeah,
a really great guy. I felt very lucky to be able to work with him.
absolutely. So you mentioned Steven Spielberg a little while ago, and how you two connected with making of the Goonies. So tell me about that experience. I mean, Steven Spielberg is one of these people who continues to work. I feel like his peak has never ended, right? He continues to create amazing work, just like Stephen King, who we'll get into later. But tell me about Steven Spielberg and working with someone as amazing as him.
Well, I agree with you completely. This is a guy who seems to have been born with celluloid running through his veins rather than blood. Well, now digital media, but just such a great guy. I first met him. I was doing an interview show on the Z Channel, which was the first pay TV channel in Los Angeles. And I had a show called the Fantasy Film Festival. And it was entirely local to LA. And the cable company was mostly seen on the West Side, which meant Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, the places where people in the industry lived, including Spielberg. So I interviewed him on that show, and he said afterwards, like, I don't usually feel this way, but I really enjoyed this interview, Mick. It was really great. So a couple years later, when I was doing publicity at Universal, I was in a publicity meeting for E.T. where he was showing us the first 15 minutes he'd cut together of E.T. And the table is surrounded by the marketing and publicity executives of Universal and me. And he walks into the room and goes, "Oh, hi, Mick, good to see you." And all eyes suddenly turned on me. And it was like, oh, this meeting is starting well. But when I was making the Goonies documentary, my agent had sent a spec script to his company. And while I was making the Goonies documentary, someone was writing coverage of this spec script I've done. And the coverage was as if my mother had written it. It was so effusive. And the last 3 words of that coverage were, "Hire this man." At the time, Stephen said to me while we were setting up the lights for the interview, "You must do a lot of these." And I said something you should never say to Steven Spielberg, but, well, I'm trying not to. I'm trying to make a go of it as a writer. But it just was the right timing, the right place. And he said, "Really, we're looking for writers for this new show I'm doing called Amazing Stories." And so then I found out that he saw the coverage for my script, and they called me up and said to me, "Steven Spielberg's on the phone." And I'm like to my wife, Cynthia, Steven Spielberg's on the telephone. And they asked me to write the first script written for Amazing Stories. I wrote it in 3 days. They really liked it. I was on food stamps at the time. They really liked it, asked me to do one right away, and a day and a half later asked me to go on staff as a story editor. And Steven was always so encouraging and so eager to help. You know, he was so receptive to my work, and it was really, by the time I directed an episode of Amazing Stories, one that he had asked me to do, it turned out really well, and it really launched a career that would never have happened without him. The people who started hiring would never have even read my scripts, and never did when they were in front of them. But Steven was such a wonderful collaborator. And, you know, the first thing I directed for him, the only thing I've directed for Steven, was an episode of Amazing Stories called Life on Death Row that I wrote the story as well. And before I started shooting, we sat together for 2 hours because he asked me to storyboard the whole thing. And for 2 hours, we went over that storyboard. And that 2 hours was 2 years worth of film school. It was just fantastic.
Oh, it's interesting. You know, I was just watching a behind the scenes before we jumped on this interview. I was watching behind the scenes documentary about the making of a live action CG film of Resident Evil. It's called Resident Evil Infinite Darkness. It was on Netflix. And the director, who is Japanese, had never directed CG. He's only directed live action. And he said that he hates storyboards because he feels that they're kind of restrictive. And then you feel like you need to basically stick to the storyboard. And actually what he does, which I never heard of before, is doing kind of a video storyboard where it's basically video, doing like a demo essentially of the scene with a bunch of people.
Animatic.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I don't storyboard much anymore, except when it's special effects or stunts where every shot specifically needs to be handled a certain way and everybody has to be on the same page about it. But I agree with him completely about feeling restricted by it, because when you show up on the set, inevitably something's going to be different. The door is going to be on the other side of the room. You'll come up with new ideas. And if you are a slave to your storyboards, it is the enemy of creativity. And the ability to be resilient and to roll with the punches that come up 100 times a day on any production, on television or movie production, people calcify when they rely on storyboards. And I think you need to figure out a shot list in advance, which is what I do every weekend before the week of shooting. I will shot list the whole week's work. But generally, I won't even look at it during the week. And sometimes I'll shoot every shot on my shot list. Sometimes it'll be 100% different. But I will have already shot the movie in my head so that I'm prepared for come what may. And I totally agree with him about that. But I think there is an important element to storyboarding, and that is stunts, where things are dangerous, where things have to be, everybody, the head of every department needs to know exactly what's going into the shots. And with special effects, although digital technology has matured to such a point where you can just think off the top of your head while you're on the set doing visual effects. It used to be you'd have to have those shots planned out perfectly before you shot them, but now there's more flexibility.
Absolutely. And I've had the good fortune of interviewing some amazing #1 New York Times bestselling authors, Lee Child, Harlan Coben, Lisa Scottolini, and others, a lot of thriller writers. And I've noticed a couple things with them. One, Harlan Coben, who is incredibly successful, is just as insecure as someone that is just starting out. Like, one minute he's writing it and he's like, this is brilliant, they're going to love it. The next minute he's saying, this is crap, I'm a hack, everyone's going to hate this. So that insecurity seems to never go away as a writer, at least for him. And then Lisa had said to me one time that writer's block isn't real. Like, if you just need to sit down and start writing. that you can't wait for a muse or inspiration. What are your thoughts on that? Insecurity as a writer and kind of this whole waiting around to be inspired.
I agree 100% with both of them. And I think if you are not afraid you're going to fuck it up every time out, then you are a hack. If you're too confident, it's because you're relying on old tricks, the old ways of doing things that you've done them before. And so I think fear is a great motivating factor in creativity. And I think that's what Harlan Coben, who I'm a big fan of, was saying. But I also think that I've never had writer's block in my life. And sometimes, whether with books or short stories or with scripts or whatever, you start with a character and an idea, and my hands do the writing more than my brain does. And I also don't, when you're writing on assignment for movies or television, you have to outline everything pretty specifically before you get the green light to actually write a screenplay. But if I'm writing on spec, I do not outline. I start on page one and let the muse take me. But that muse is always awake. She's never lying asleep and dormant and giving me trouble.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like I just wrote a piece, I think it was a week or so ago, called Quitting My Job is My Best Career Move, right? And I wasn't sure what I was going to write, but I just sat down and started to write, and I realized this is kind of long. I should have subheadings. And then I broke it up a certain way. So I just kind of reacted to what I was writing in real time rather than saying this is exactly what it's going to be like. Like I had an idea in my head of here's where we're going, but I just kind of saw where did the writing take me, and then how can I make sure that it's as good as it can be, and then put it out there, and then got lots of great positive feedback. But had I like labored over like I need to know exactly how every piece is going to be, otherwise I can't start, would have been it just would have been like paralysis by analysis, you know?
No, I think you're exactly right. And that's a really great point. I'm so impressed by people who say, well, it took me 6 months to write this script, or it took me a year to write this script. I've never spent more than 5 weeks on a draft of a script. And the first draft is very close to the finished draft usually, because it's inspiration that guides it rather than doggedness. The idea, if I spend a lot of time on the work, it's because it's not working, and it comes out fluidly because it is real. It's generated by enthusiasm and the excitement of the moment, and those are the things I find most exciting. I couldn't stand the idea of outlining a script before I started, and the ones I've had the most success with that were my own just came out of me in that way. But yeah, I think inspiration. I think Lisa's absolutely right about writer's block. It's an excuse that I think creative people like to think they're above civilians and give themselves the artistic personality and the like. But if you're a writer and you're a real writer, you just write, and the ideas will come. You take your character, you take your inspiration, and you just let them run you through the ringer.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of writers, I mean, you've worked with some amazing people. One of the people who I really admire, who you've worked with, is Clive Barker. I think Clive is one of the most creative people ever. And the thing I really appreciate about his creativity is that it's unrestrained. Like a lot of times people would be like, "Oh, I can't be that dark. I can't go that far. How will people view me?" Almost like shame kind of prevents you from reaching your full potential. But with him, I feel like there is no shame. He just basically says, "I'm going to put it all out there. This is my idea. Here we go." And like I remember being on a vacation this past summer with my wife, and I was reading one of the stories from book's Blood, and it was like a gay sex scene or something, and I was actually laughing out loud, not because it was funny, but because of how amazingly he describes scenes. Like he takes something that could be mundane, or someone else would describe in kind of a pedestrian way, and he does it with such creative flair that it's just incredible. Like no one else could effectively write that way other than Clive, and it's just remarkable. So, what are your thoughts on Clive, his creativity, and your experiences working with him?
Well, your timing is perfect because he and I have been working on a pilot together that we wrote together that it doesn't look like it's going forward yet, but he's written 10 original new stories for an anthology of Clive Barker stories. The network it was written for is experiencing some problems, and it's probably not, well, it's definitely not going to happen with them. Hopefully we'll find another home for it. But one of the things when I was starting writing fiction, taking that seriously, after I'd already gotten a good start in screenwriting, was could I be that unlocked as first Stephen King, and then when I was introduced to Clive Barker with the Books of Blood, just could I be that completely free and put myself out there as nakedly as Clive Barker does in terms of sex and violence and writing about it? You know, the splatterpunk days is when that was happening. And so there was actually a book called Silver Scream that was edited by David Scow. And I was asked to write a story. It had King, it had Barker, it had Skip Inspector. And so I thought, can I be as unbroken as they are, as unlocked as they are in those terms? And I ended up writing probably the most disgusting story of the whole bunch. Entertainingly disgusting, but I was proud that I was able to unshackle myself like that. But writing with Clive is such a total pleasure, or working with him. He is the most wonderful, loving gentleman you could possibly imagine spending time with. He's so generous with his creativity and sharing, and working together with him has been such a total pleasure. Between him and Stephen King, I am the luckiest collaborator on the face of the planet. King, Spielberg, Barker, all of these people, and everybody on the Masters of Horror show. I just feel grateful every day to be able to work with such creatively generous people and people whom I admire so deeply.
Yeah, he's remarkable. I'm glad I had the opportunity to meet him a few years back, and that he's doing better than he was then. So, and
Yeah.
that's great to hear that you guys are working together. So that's very exciting. Some breaking news here.
Well, we've been really good friends for over 30 years, and I just think the world of him, and as a human being as well as an artist. And he is such an icon and so unique in every way. You pick up page one of any of his stories and you know you're reading Clive Barker.
Oh yeah. And I mean, the fact that he's taken on so many different mediums, whether it be painting, writing, directing, video games. I mean, there's just been so many mediums that he's just explored, and I love people that do that. People who don't let their creativity just atrophy, right? I mean, some singers and people like that would just kind of, rest on their laurels, and they won't really produce new things. But I feel like if you're a creative force, you should create till the day you die, whatever that means. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same over and over again. And I'm delighted that he just continues to create.
And it's not just creating, it's evolving. It's not calcifying. It's not treading ground he's trod before. He and any real artist, I think, is constantly evolving and is taking in the world around them as the world itself evolves. And in the world of entertainment, not just the technology, but the storytelling and all of that it entails, to be on top of it and ahead of the curve, when you're 70 years old, as Clive is really impressive, because he's a hero of mine, because he always feels like he's 25 years old and striking out on new ground.
Yeah, and when I met him, I talked to him about something probably most people didn't. I brought up Mr. Be Gone, which was a book of his that was written, I think, entirely in second person. And I said, that's insane. Like, that is so hard. The fact that you wrote a whole book from that point of view. I mean, I remember reading the book, and it's saying like, don't turn the page, burn this book, like get rid of it. And then you turn the page and you keep reading. It's like, what? You're still reading this? Like, and it felt like he's speaking directly to you. And I was like, this is so remarkable.
And indeed he is.
Just incredible. Another person who I've never had the opportunity to meet, unfortunately, and he's no longer with us, but is Wes Craven. And just again, another intelligent person who's just produced. Like I constantly, it's the first Nightmare on Elm Street I ever saw was Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and it remains my favorite. I like to say I love that movie back before it was cool to love it. And yeah, I just think it's brilliant. And what are your thoughts on Wes and just any experiences you have with him?
Well, Wes is great. I interviewed him on the TV version of Postmortem before there was a podcast. And he used to come to the Masters of Horror dinners that I'd put together. I basically put together a group of dinners of filmmakers in the horror genre that grew to like 35 of them would come to a dinner together. And Wes was always there. He's so intelligent, the former school teacher, and just so smart, and a very dry and wry sense of humor. But I really loved Wes, and I was really surprised. I always felt like we were friendly with one another, but Before I Wake, he had a screening of that. He called me and asked me if he would come to Universal, to the screening room, to see his latest film. And what I didn't know was I was the only person that he'd invited to that screening. It was just me and Wes and his wife, Aya, and his editor. And it was a total surprise to me to be the only guest in a big screening room at Universal, that he had that kind of trust and interest in what my feedback about his movie would be. And it was very emotional at the time, that realization. And losing him was such a shocking loss. I had no idea it was coming. And I don't think anybody did, other than those who were closest to him. And I just think he was such a groundbreaking filmmaker. You know, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, you know, the first one was the first. There was nothing like it before that. You know, the coming out of dreams into reality, that whole idea of Freddy Krueger, before it was all about the jokes and wisecracks, was really what made that movie special. And only Wes could have done that. And just what he did with Scream and all those things. But he was also a real gentleman, and a really, really sweet and very intelligent man.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Freddy, you wound up directing an episode of Freddy's Nightmares, which was obviously a TV show that spawned from the film series. What was that experience like for you? You know, kind of taking Wes's creation, if you will, and kind of into your own hands.
Well, cheap and fast is what it was mostly. But Gil Adler, who produced the series, was a friend of mine, and I had made The Stand, which turned out to be a huge success. And so I introduced him to Tobe Hooper, who directed the first episode, and Tom McLaughlin, who directed the second episode, and I did the third. But it was great. They asked me to do three of the wraparounds for three of the shows, so I got to do the Freddy scenes for three of the episodes, mine and two others. But the shows were done very, very quickly. They were very low budget. They were shot in 16 millimeter, edited on video, standard definition video on Betamaxes, as a matter of fact. And it was so much fun. But Freddy was not a part of most of the episodes. Special episodes he was, but he just was the crypt keeper, basically. And in fact, they hired the same producer, Gil Adler, to produce Tales from the Crypt afterwards, with a much bigger budget. But it was so much fun, you know, having been able to play with a couple of iconic horror characters like Freddy, and then Norman Bates in Psycho 4, you know, to be able to play in the same playground of these iconic characters was fantastic. And it was rush, to do the show. It was independent, very low budget, but people who were really talented and who really cared about making the best it could be. And it was a great experience. I had a really good time.
And there's about to be a documentary come out, I think later this year, which I backed, about Robert Englund. And Robert is just a brilliant actor, because when you see interviews with him, you understand the nuance of what he does. And when he talks about how with Freddie, he kind of slouched a little to one side like a gunslinger with the gun in his hand, right? Like a lot of thought went into the way he presented Freddie, both verbally and physically. I mean, what are your thoughts on Robert?
Well, he's a really smart guy and very loquacious, as you probably know if you've met him. But I really liked him a lot. It was fun working with him, and he directed a couple of movies, and I thought he did a really good job. He is very self-deprecating about himself as a director, but he's funny, he's smart, he's great to be around, he's great with fans, and I love seeing people give fans, especially somebody who's in such an elevated position in fan culture, to be able to give back to the fans in a way that respects them, and appreciating that without them, he would not have the career that he's had, such a great career. And he's just a really good human being. And that's the case with a lot of people in the horror genre, even more so than in the mainstream, because I feel that we're all kind of outsiders. We all live in a gutter as far as the perception of the mainstream world around us. So I think that bonds us, it brings us together. And even the same goes with the Masters of Horror dinners. It feels like all of us are a bunch of outsiders who've been lucky enough to find friends that we wouldn't have found otherwise.
And actually, I'm happy you brought that up, because I wanted to circle back to that. Those Masters of Horror dinners, I mean, that's got to be incredible. Did this just kind of happen organically, where you just invited a few friends and all of a sudden it just started to grow? And do you guys actually talk about horror? Or do you wind up talking about anything except horror, because that's your job?
Well, it was very specific. For years, we'd run into each other at a Directors Guild event or a film festival or a convention or something and say, we all ought to get together sometime. And I realized nobody was going to do that if I didn't do it. And so the very first one, it took me a week of calling and trying to work out schedules and all. And there were 12 of us, but including John Landis, John Carpenter, Wes was there, Guillermo del Toro was there, Stuart Gordon was there, Toby Hooper was there. There were 12 of us. And it was at a little French restaurant in the Valley. And we had such a good time together that when I called to put together the next one a month or so later, it took me an hour to put it together. And then, friends would ask, is it okay to bring so-and-so? And I say, it's not my dinner, it's our dinner, whatever you want. But the only requirement was that you had to have made a horror film released in theaters, and because otherwise there'd be 100 people there. And but more and more people there'd be some people who would ask to be invited, or there would be other people that I would meet, or any of the people who come to the dinners would bring with them. John Landis brought Alejandro Brugués, he brought Michael Mann, he brought various people. And so it just became a big thing. We haven't done it since before the pandemic, well before the pandemic. But the last one we did was in honor of Toby Hooper when he passed away, in his memory. And there were 35 horror directors all jammed into this restaurant. And it was emotional and fun and funny and wonderful. And yeah, we talk about everything. We don't just talk about horror movies, but one of the things that led to the Masters of Horror series was us talking about not being in charge of our own fates, and how studios didn't understand horror, didn't appreciate it, didn't want to do it. And wouldn't it be great to be able to tell stories the way we want to tell them, rather than the way they tell us to tell them? And so that's where the idea for the series was born. But the name came from that very first dinner. And I know you know this story, but There was a party of people they were having a birthday party at the table next to the table the dozen of us were sitting at. And so they started singing happy birthday. We all joined in and sang happy birthday to that table as well. They had no idea who we were. And at the end, Guillermo del Toro stands up and says, "The Masters of Horror wish you a happy birthday." And so that was how the name of the group came to be. It was self-effacing and self-mocking, but it was too good a title not to use for the series when that happened.
Oh, that's great. Well, I hope you guys do get back together again sometime soon. And you mentioned the TV show, so yeah, we got to dive into that for a bit. Obviously, we know what inspired it, but what was it like to kind of be the person who said, "Hey, let's make this happen," and then you went ahead and did it, and had all these amazing people to work with to produce these episodes?
Well, humbling in the best possible way. The idea that I was able to be the ringleader in this criminal group of gutter snipes was pretty amazing. I knew most of the directors that were invited in to do it, but I didn't know if John Carpenter was going to do it or all these people. But I had to basically get people to agree, if we get this show off the ground, would you say on paper that if you're available, you would do it? And it was quite emotional, the people who agreed to it, including people who, because of scheduling, weren't able to, like George Romero and Wes Craven, both of whom were planning on doing it, but it just didn't work out in their schedules. But very humbling to be able to bring in people like Carpenter and Hooper and Landis and Joe Dante and Stuart Gordon and Dario Argento and Takashi Miike from Japan, doing it in Japan. It was humbling and thrilling, and I couldn't believe I've produced little movies made by the best horror filmmakers in the world, and I get to play because it was my basketball. So, I was allowed to make films for this show without interference. And that's what the great thing was offering these terrific filmmakers the opportunity to act like they hadn't been able to since their independent beginnings. To be able to say, as long as you do it on time and on budget, which is not a lot of time and not a lot of money, we're not going to get in your way creatively. You have final cut. It's your show. It's John Carpenter's episode. It's Tobe Hooper's episode. We want each episode to bear the imprint of the creators and not have a style for the series, but just a style for each of the little movies.
That's really wonderful. And you mentioned Tobe Hooper, that you honored him at the last Masters of Horror dinner. Tobe was an incredible creative force in the horror world, but it did seem like there were times where he kind of struggled with recognition for his work. And, I don't know that he's as universally praised commercially, perhaps, as someone as like a Wes Craven or John Carpenter. And but obviously he deserves a ton of credit for all the amazing work that he did. I mean, what are your thoughts on Tobe? And I don't know if it was an insecurity on his part, or if it was just legitimate that people just weren't giving him credit where credit's due. I mean, why do you think he might not be as where he needs to be, frankly, when it comes to being Mount Rushmore?
Well, I think Mount Rushmore definitely would include him just on the basis of Texas Chainsaw Massacre alone. That changed the course of modern horror movies as much as Halloween did 4 years earlier. Texas Chainsaw was 4 years earlier. But Tobe was a really sweet guy, certainly one of the closest of my friends out of all of the masters. And he had a tough time getting good projects. People did not give him the credit that he deserved for Poltergeist. That movie was a huge success. It had a very strong producer whose hand can be seen throughout that movie. but Toby was the director and was on set, and I was a publicist on Poltergeist, and I was on that set. And I can tell you that Toby Hooper was there directing the movie alongside Steven Spielberg, who was a very hands-on producer who wrote the shooting draft of the script and was on the set most days. So it was a genuine collaboration between producer and director. And I was able to bring them together again later on the series The Others, which Steven had asked me to be supervising producer on. And I asked him about hiring Toby to do an episode of the show. And he was excited by the idea for them to work together again for the first time since Poltergeist. But I think people did not give him the credit, and he didn't get offered great projects. And Toby's not a writer, he's a director. I mean, he co-wrote Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but he's as good as the material. And he often did not have great material to work with. And people were kind of afraid of him because of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They didn't feel like he was really mainstream despite Poltergeist. And because Poltergeist was a huge hit, but credited more to Spielberg than to him, that definitely had an effect on his career. And he was capable of such great work. I think his 2 episodes of Masters of Horror are 2 of the best. And, you know, being able to give him a hands-off couple of jobs, give him a couple of movies where he was in creative control, and Richard Christian Matheson wrote the scripts, and he's a very talented writer. And they'd written, Richard had written an episode of Amazing Stories that Toby had directed. So there were opportunities that were denied him, that were given to other directors. And maybe it's because he was not as aggressive or ambitious as some of the others, or just people were afraid of the guy who directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But the guy was a teddy bear and hugely talented, and just one of the sweetest people I've ever known, and one of the most creative people I've ever known. And you see Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the brutality of it, and then you meet the teddy bear who made it, who self-professed was not a teddy bear when he made that movie, but that kind of grew into that role. But you know, he was a wonderful, creative human being, and I think the world of him and miss him a lot. And you're right, he deserves to be on Mount Rushmore of horror. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. So Stephen King. Stephen King.
Who?
You know, the other Stephen that you worked with. I interviewed Bev Vincent a few months back when his great book about Stephen King's career came out. And around that time, I also interviewed Douglas E. Winter, who wrote the biography of Clive Barker. And so Stephen King's just one of these people where I always use Billy Joel as my example. And what I mean by that is Billy Joel hasn't really created much in the past 10, 15 years, even though he's incredibly talented. But Stephen King, who could have easily retired 20, 30 years ago, just based on his success in the years prior, has continued to evolve, like we've been talking about, and produce top tier work and regularly. It's not like you have to wait that long for a new Stephen King book. He's another one coming out later this year. I mean, just an incredible creative force. And I love him on Twitter too. I feel like he's a voice of reason in this crazy world we live in. And, you know, what are your thoughts on Stephen as a person, as a creator, and your experiences working with him?
Well, I am so lucky. We've done like 8 or 9 projects together. I'm working on something now based on his material that we'll see if it goes. But the most creatively generous and humanly generous person I know, he and Clive both. Working with him the first time was on Sleepwalkers. And we shot the film. We only talked to each other on the phone and communicated by fax when we would need some rewriting. I would either do it or I would ask him if he wanted to, and he would say, let me take a crack at it. And the next morning there'd be a stack of pages in the fax machine, which nobody who's watching this will remember. But what's a fax machine? But we became friendly after that. He really, really liked how Sleepwalkers came out. And so when The Stand came along, he asked me if I would do that. I'd never done anything of that scope. Nobody had, frankly, in television, certainly. but we had such a great experience and we became friends. Stephen King was around for probably 2/3 of that 100-day shoot. He was on the set, on location. And in all of the time we've worked together, he's never ever said, Mick, you should try this. You should do it this way. He's always given me the rope to hang myself. I will obviously avail myself of his presence and ask what he thinks, get his opinion or thoughts, motivations on what was behind why he wrote something a certain way. Because if you have a resource like Stephen King at your beck and call, who would not? But he knows the difference between movies and books. He knows that the books aren't movies and that you don't fuck a book up by making a bad movie. The book stays just as good as it was before. And he's been supportive and just a really wonderfully generous guy to work with. He loves good ideas. So many of them come from him, but if you come up with an idea that he likes, he gets really excited about it. And we've had such a great creative and personal collaboration. Again, I consider myself lucky, and every day I'm grateful for being able to have done so much work with him and people like him over the course of decades now. And I'm just humbled by it. And I still feel like the kid, even, I'm 71 years old now, but I feel like the kid doing what I do. And because I'm trying to fill the shoes of massive shoes that have come before me. I get to step in those massive footprints and hopefully learn something every time out from these people who are so masterful at what they do.
And one of the great projects you worked on related to Stephen King, obviously, is The Shining with Steven Weber. And by the way, the first audiobook that I listened to that blew me away and got me hooked on audiobooks was Steven Weber narrating it.
I knew that's what you were going to say.
Incredible. I mean, like, his performance was so dark and so menacing that I was just like, audiobooks are amazing. I have to listen to more. So it was just incredible. And a lot of people actually prefer your version of The Shining to the movie. So what are your thoughts on that experience and working with Steven Weber?
Well, the most important thing is that Stephen King likes that version better than the movie. The whole reason that the miniseries exists was The Stand was the most watched miniseries in history. And ABC said to Stephen King, what would you like to do next? And B, King famously never liked Kubrick's version of The Shining. Now, when I saw it a couple of days before it came out at a screening, and I had read the book, and I'd never loved a book more than I loved The Shining. And I was so crashingly disappointed because it wasn't Stephen King. Now, over the years, I've learned to appreciate the fact that it's a great Kubrick film, but it is not a great Stephen King adaptation. And the opportunity to do it, I never thought twice about it. When Steve asked if I would do it with him, of course, I said, yes, I love this book. I'd love the opportunity to adapt this book to the screen because The Shining was so disappointing to a fan of the book. Now, look, Kubrick's a genius. Kubrick made a Kubrick film that's a great Kubrick film. And it will stand longer than the miniseries will stand just by the very nature of it. But the ability to work with King again, King and Kubrick, the two Ks are very different. King is warm and Kubrick is cold and clinical and technical. But the humanity of King's novel needed to be translated to the screen for it to be a success. And the fact that King wrote the screenplay himself, as he did for The Stand, was a good start. But we didn't get Steven Weber until 3 days before shooting began, because nobody wanted to step into Jack Nicholson's shoes. Nobody wanted the first line of every review to be, so-and-so is okay, but he ain't no Jack Nicholson. And so we came close. We had a British actor who had said yes to us, And then we couldn't get a hold of him at all. We're 3 weeks away, 3 days away from shooting. And Stephen King said, if we don't hire somebody today, I'm pulling the plug. We're not doing this. And that day, Steven Weber came in and read with Rebecca De Mornay, who'd already been cast. And I'd never seen Wings. I knew he was mostly a comedic actor, so I only knew him from his reading. And he just blew our minds. He was so great, and he got it so well. And I can't think of anybody, first of all, who's more fun to work with, but more dedicated and understood that role of Jack Torrance so well. And it was such a joy to go to work with him every day. And just, he got it. He's a huge King fan. And he just, that reading that day, not only was a sense of relief because we could make the movie, but it was, this is the best possible human being to play Jack Torrance at this moment in history. And he's still a very good friend. And we had lunch not long ago with some of the other people who've done some King work or worked with us. And I was lucky enough to work with him in Desperation again. And just, he was on Masters of Horror in one of Dario's episodes. And I love him as a human, and as an actor, he's just so versatile. He's funny, he's dramatic, he's heartbreaking, he's emotionally deep and rich, and just, I can't say enough good things about him.
Yeah, it's tremendous. And a project I know you're particularly proud of is Riding the Bullet. For those who aren't familiar, share with us,
And that's most of us.
No, but tell us about it. Why do you love that so much? And, what are your memories of that experience?
Well, I won't say it's the thing I'm most proud of. It's the thing that's most personal to me. And we had very little money to make. And 20% of that money was for the screenplay rights to the author of the story. I wrote the script myself. First of all, it's a fairly straightforward ghost story in Stephen King's story, which he wrote in 1999. It was the first thing he wrote after the accident that almost killed him. So it was published on the internet. It was not written. It was not published on paper until later when it was collected. But there was something about it, about loss. I had lost my brother and I had lost my father shortly before having made this movie. And the idea of making a bet, a Sophie's Choice bet, where there's no good choice about who the emissary of death is going to take with him, a 21-year-old art student or his mother who has been ailing. He's going to take one of them. The art student has to make the choice. And if he doesn't choose, he'll take them both. It was a really potent Sophie's Choice that felt really personal to me. And so the first half of that movie doesn't have much to do with the short story except preliminarily. And it turns him into an art student rather than just a kid who's hitchhiking home to see his mom because she's had a heart attack. It's a guy who is sensitive. He's an artist. He attempts suicide because he thinks his life has gone so wrong after his girlfriend leaves him. And he discovers the value of his life. His art was all really dark art. He considered himself the Prince of Darkness because he would draw images of death. He would paint his walls with death imagery, and all of this really dark stuff. And as someone who makes dark material as an author, as a filmmaker and screenwriter, it was just really personal to me. And there were scenes from my life in my childhood and my relationship with my mother at that time. Although he's a single, he is an only child in the movie. I was one of 4 and then eventually one of 7 when my mother remarried and had 3 more kids. But there's just a lot of really personal stuff in there that I decided to be kind of naked in the writing of this one. and let it, it's not all autobiographical, but a lot of it is, and a lot of the more emotional stuff comes from my own life and my own experience.
That's wonderful. Um, Critters. I feel like we have to talk about Critters, which is like the polar opposite of Riding the Bullet, right?
Totally.
Yeah, tonally they're very different. But Critters is this wonderful franchise that it still continues to this day. And you had the opportunity to direct. It was your first feature film, Critters 2. What was that
Yeah.
experience like? And how do you direct something like that, where you're like, okay, I want it to be enjoyable and fun and this and that, but I also don't want to come off as like too hokey. And I mean, because that's a really delicate balance you have to strike, right?
Right. Horror comedies are usually dire. They're usually neither scary nor funny. And there'd already been a Critters 1. It was a very modest success. It grossed, I think, $10 million at the box office, and the budget was $2 million. And it's very Spielbergian. And I think the reason that Bob Shea, the head of New Line Pictures, offered it to me was because I was a writer and they needed it rewritten because the original writer said, no, it's perfect, I'm done. And there were things they felt needed attenuation. And they gave me complete creative input on where I would take that rewrite, as long as it would solve some of their problems they had. And the Spielbergian thing, they were getting a writer and a director 2-for-1, and I was coming fresh out of the Spielberg world. And I think they were hoping that some of that sparkle from Steven would have rubbed off on me and would rub off on this movie. And Spielberg, of course, was a great influence even before I started working for him and with him. But this was also the opportunity to amplify the humor. Take the characters are what make Critters 2 work. And I say make it work. It was a total disaster. If it had been expensive enough to be a disaster, when it came out, nobody went. But the great thing is it keeps being revived. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a screening in Burbank that was packed, and everybody reacted the way they reacted in the sneak preview in 1988, which they didn't bother to come out to the theaters to see after that. But it keeps getting revived at Easter time on television and in theaters and festivals around the world. And it's thrilling to see because it really is made to play with an audience. And everything difficult about making a movie was thrown at me in my first feature. And it was kids and pets and locations and night shoots and puppets and visual effects and all these things with no money to pay for it. So it was grueling, and it was trial by fire. I had done a couple of TV shows, but I'd never done a movie. And this was my opportunity to test myself and my mettle and see if I could get through it. But I didn't think about how grueling it would be, but it was everything difficult about making a movie. But I had a director of photography in Russell Carpenter, who went on to win an Oscar for Titanic years later. I had a great cast. I had the Kyoto brothers doing the puppets and creatures and the giant critter ball. And I had enough free rein that New Line Cinema gave me, through Bob Shea, the owner at the time, to really indulge a sense of humor. I've only made 2 comedies, and one is half of Quicksilver Highway and one is Critters 2. I have a sense of humor in everything that I've done. There's some humor, but nothing that goes right for the laughs. And what I think I learned about Critters 2 was, by doing Critters 2, was to trust my instincts, to take the horror seriously, to take the laughs, really go for it, and allow myself to go beyond the pale, into a Warner Brothers cartoon world, the way that Gremlins did, which of course was the main inspiration for Critters in the first place. But also to invest in these characters. Nana was named after my grandmother. Take these characters seriously, even though it's an idealized Norman Rockwell America, but give them emotion and let them have real humanity in them, in what a normal movie from the 80s that had little puppet creatures would not normally do. And, you know, I think it has helped that movie live a much longer life than it ever should have, because it's still, like I said, it still plays and plays to audiences in ways that you would not expect to be 35 years later. Yeah.
No, not at all. And that's fantastic. And yeah, right now there's like this renaissance of 80s horror where people are just loving it, revisiting it, the In Search of Darkness documentaries. And you mentioned Bob Shea. I had the opportunity to meet and interview Lynn, his sister. And I think Bob is an incredible person, not just because of Nightmare on Elm Street, but you mentioned New Line. He basically took it from this really tiny studio and it became this juggernaut. But they also, which a lot of people don't think about, rolled the dice on Lord of the Rings, which became gigantic. I mean, what are your thoughts on just Bob and New Line and just kind of their willingness to say, hey, we're gonna kind of go all in on Elm Street or Lord of the Rings, or just kind of not necessarily be conservative when it comes to creative projects?
Yeah, well, he started out basically, you know, with John Waters movies and distributing them. He didn't produce them, but he would get them at a very low price and distribute them. And then he started making movies, and eventually Nightmare on Elm Street really paid off for him, became a franchise. But he's a really smart guy, and I hear he can be a tough businessman, but he gave me my first movie and was entirely encouraging. And he's been on the podcast and told me stories that I had no idea were going on years after the fact when he was on the podcast. And, you know, he was a risk taker. And that was a huge gamble on the Lord of the Rings movies. It was a commitment to 3 very expensive movies by a company that was an independent and that was basically putting every penny they had into those movies and trusting Peter Jackson, who had not had much in the way of hit movies before that. He'd had successful independent movies, but never something on that level. You know, The Frighteners was his biggest movie up until then, I think, or The Lovely Bones. But I have nothing but respect for Bob. I really like the guy. Every experience I've ever had with him was positive. So I don't know the tough businessman side of him that I'm sure he's left behind once he was able to. He sold New Line to Warner Brothers and remained on the board and all of that stuff. So I don't think he needs to be tough about anything. He can relax. But my experience with Bob is that he's really smart, really encouraging, and everything I had to do with Bob was positive, including his appearance on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just have a few more things I want to touch on because your career and your life has just been so incredible. There's so much to cover. Something I can't
grateful every day, I got to tell you.
Yeah, you must pinch yourself every day to be like, did that actually happen? One of those moments is you were in Michael Jackson's Thriller, right? Tell me about that. Life is a zombie.
Yeah, my wife and I were both in Thriller because we were friends with Rick Baker and with John Landis, and I knew all of these makeup effects guys, and Rick said, "Do you guys want to be zombies in this music video we're doing with Michael Jackson?" So, you know, Landis invited us, and Rick invited us, and my wife worked for 3 days on it. I worked for 1 day on it. But it was phenomenal. It was great. And the opportunity, you know, I think the video was shot in somewhere between 3 and 5, probably 5 days in downtown LA in a warehouse next to a meat packing plant. That was really pleasant. But Michael was exciting and sweet and, excuse me, so shy and quiet until John would call action, and then bang, he was just so dynamic and powerful and entertaining. And years later, after I'd been shooting The Stand, he and Stephen King collaborated on a script for a music video, and King recommended me. And so I met with Michael, and I directed the first 2 weeks of a movie that fell apart of this music video. that fell apart during one of the first scandal that happened with Michael. And it was finished 3 years later by Stan Winston because I was directing The Shining. And
What
Stan
was the
and
video?
Michael, it was called Michael Jackson's Ghosts was what it was eventually called. It was originally called Is This Scary? And you can see Ghosts online anywhere. And it's on the Michael Jackson collection, DVD collection of number ones. But what I shot 3 years earlier and cut together somehow got onto YouTube. And I don't know how, but it was before we finished all of the shoot. But what I had shot over the 2 weeks while I was shooting and we cut together is, you can find it on YouTube under Is This Scary with Michael Jackson.
Wow, that's crazy. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. So you mentioned John Landis. John's got a great sense of humor.
To say the least.
Yeah, and he's done some interesting films. I mean, aside from the experiences you talked about before, it's what are your thoughts on him? Just as like again, I keep saying creative force, but that's what these people are, right? They just have so much talent. It's not really limited to one film or franchise.
Well, he's a hurricane. You know, John is one of the funniest human beings on the planet and just a powerful force. I mean, he is so entertaining and so knowledgeable. You know, he's so well read, and in terms of cinema history as well, and just an amazing guy. And you know, the Twilight Zone accident had a huge effect on him, and it was a disastrous thing that no one could have predicted. And you know, it breaks my heart that anybody involved had to go through that experience. Obviously, mostly the people who lost their lives during it, but those people who survived it, it also was quite crushing to them. And I saw the effects on Landis himself quite closely. I went to the trial a few times, and that was rough to sit through.
Yeah, and Joe Dante is another one who I've just been very impressed by. I mean, he actually went to college here in Philadelphia. He went to the University of the Arts, and just again, there's a lot of really highly intelligent and humorous people in the horror world, and I feel like Joe definitely fits that mold.
Joe is one of the great film historians of all time. I don't know if you've heard the podcast he does with Josh Holson called The Movies That Made Me, but he is an encyclopedia of cinema history. He can tell you who the cinematographer was on the best, you know, the number one movie in 1942. He just is a font of knowledge, and he's so funny and so talented. He's also a really talented cartoonist. He draws his own storyboards, and just the wit in his movies. And I've been lucky enough, the first short film I made, I put him in it as an actor, and he put me in The Howling as an actor for one line. And Joe is such a good friend, such a really good guy. And his politics, like Landis's, are very similar to the Stephen King politics you mentioned on his Twitter feed, and my own. So, you know, I admire John and Joe so much. They're very similar in a lot of ways and very different in other ways, but they both are incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly hilarious people to be around.
And you mentioned John Carpenter when we started this conversation about being in the room, and he's working on the music for Halloween. It's interesting because you watch John Carpenter interviews, and I feel like he kind of has a simplicity to what he does. I think fans overanalyze things constantly, right? We're always looking for hidden meanings in Halloween and this long-running franchise. But when you see interviews with John Carpenter, I'm just kind of struck, I guess, by he's very much like kind of matter of fact, like, yep, just trying to, you know, make it the best it can be and this and that. And I feel like sometimes what he does is overanalyzed, when in reality, he's just trying to create the best thing possible. He's not thinking like, oh, 40 years down the road, this is gonna, I think he's just saying, we're trying to make a good movie here. What are your thoughts on him?
Well, I've known him since then, the Halloween days. I've worked on publicity on a few of his films, The Fog, Halloween 2, and The Thing. I did the making of The Thing. And we've worked together on Masters of Horror. He is the most no bullshit guy you'll ever meet. But he also likes to play the curmudgeon. He's self-deprecating to a fault. And I think it's to disarm. It's like it's going to work out great. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he rolls with the punches beautifully. And he just doesn't let himself get beat up by the surroundings. He takes it by the scruff of the neck and just takes it and makes it. When we were doing Masters of Horror, when I asked him to do a second one, I was so happy that he said yes, because he obviously had such a good time doing the first one. He goes, "Oh, this is just some piece of shit television show, blah, blah." It's deflecting, because his heart and soul is in everything he does. You see it on the screen. You see it in his trademark cinematography and his characters and all of that. And he obviously cares a lot, but he likes to be very self-deprecating and downplay it. And he doesn't like people to overanalyze. He doesn't overanalyze himself. But he knows what he's doing, and he's very confident about it and knows how to do it and the way he's going to do it. When he's on the set, sometimes it'll just come off the cuff and just, "Oh, I've got an idea, let's do it this way." And then suddenly it takes a whole new course. But John is great, and also really funny, but in a very dry way. It's almost a secret that he's being funny.
And I imagine you two probably bond over music too, because he's out there. He'll tour and he'll perform for live audiences, which I'm sure is,
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen his band with him and his son and his godson. And his godson, Daniel, is Dave Davies' son, who was guitarist for the Kinks. And the Kinks, we opened for the Kinks once with my band. But yeah, the love of music, and having been in bands over the years, it's definitely a fulcrum on which we meet. But it's surprising how many filmmakers, particularly in the genre, are also or have been musicians in their lives. William Malone is another one, Tom McLaughlin, people who have been in bands. Tommy's still in a band, and he's one of my peers. So, but music and rock and roll and horror movies really hold hands well.
Yeah. And speaking of John, I feel like we have to touch on Halloween. So Jamie Lee Curtis, I listened to your interview with her, the most recent one. I'm so happy that she won an Oscar. Not that awards are required for people to be legends, but I was kind of happy because, she's a fantastic actress. She's evolved over the years in so many different ways. And I do feel like it adds a certain level of legitimacy when you have someone who's like, the original Scream Queen, basically. Now
She's
Academy
so
Award winner.
deserving. Yeah, she's so deserving, and such a sweet and genuine human being, as well as being really talented in a very broad spectrum of performance, from comedy to drama. And it was thrilling to see that happen, and for that movie, which is so wonderful and groundbreaking.
Yeah. So speaking of, last year she did the Halloween Ends, and I do have a question for you about this, because I've spoken with people about it. There was a lot of Halloween Ends. There were a lot of some people loved it, some people hated it. I think where the disconnect was in the marketing. And what I mean by that is, a great writer who I interviewed and adore, Stephen James, said that when you're writing, you have to make sure you're fulfilling promises you make to the reader. And I actually talked to him about this, and he said perhaps in the marketing, they weren't fulfilling the promise that they made to the viewer, because when you watch the trailer, you're like, oh, this is going to be all about Jamie Lee and Michael. And then you tune into the movie and you're like, wait a minute, who's this other guy? And it felt like that was the majority of the film until the end. So do you think that was the problem, that they just didn't fulfill the promise?
Well, I think so. I'm not a huge fan of franchises, but the fact that Jamie was in the last trilogy elevated it a lot. But yeah, I think when you spend all this time on creating a new villain and he's not nearly as interesting as the original villain, um, it it definitely takes its toll. I'm glad the movie was successful, and I hope it is the end to the Halloween movies because it's had a really long run, and maybe it's time to rest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about this term elevated horror. This is something that is
Uh,
brought up usually ever since, well, just in recent years, really.
yeah,
And it's kind of a demeaning phrase, frankly, because it's like saying elevated Shakespeare. You know, what is
yeah,
there like shitty Shakespeare? Like, what does
yeah.
that mean? Like, why do people, and also years ago, people would call horror thrillers because it was almost like a dirty word. I mean, what are your thoughts on this whole concept of elevated horror, and why are people so insecure about being horror fans or appreciating horror?
I hate it. I think it's insulting to people who make horror because, like you said, oh, wait, Ari Aster is elevated horror. John Carpenter is just plain old horror. You're full of shit. You know, there's good horror and there's bad horror. And is Rosemary's Baby elevated horror or just good horror? Is The Exorcist elevated literary horror like Rosemary's Baby? Or is it just really good horror? And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's so rude, it can't be elevated. You know, horror is supposed to be rude. Horror is supposed to pick at your scabs. Horror is supposed to confront you with the fears that you can't otherwise take because you're doing it safely. I think elevated horror is because our genre is looked down upon with such snobbery by the so-called intelligentsia that it's horror that they can watch and not feel dirty like us little grubby gutter snipes.
You mentioned Psycho 4 earlier. I think it's fantastic. I know some people aren't a big fan of sequels. You did a wonderful job with that. Just
Thank you.
great, great movie. I mean, what are your thoughts on that experience? I mean, not just working with Anthony Perkins, but just a talented cast all around. But he was an exceptional actor. I mean, what was that like for you?
Well, it was amazing. It was complicated because he had directed Psycho 3 and wanted to direct Psycho 4, but the studio didn't want him to. And so they hired the director of Critters 2 instead. So it was difficult to, I had to prove myself to him over and over that I wasn't just somebody doing cool shots, but, you know, had character and story in mind. First of all, it was written by the same screenwriter who'd written the original Psycho, Joseph Stefano. And it was Anthony Perkins, and it was Donna Mitchell, and it was CCH Pounder, and, you know, just a truly wonderful cast. And it was an opportunity to, you know, I certainly don't consider myself Stanley Kubrick or Alfred Hitchcock or anywhere near their league, but being able to continue the story of Norman Bates with the respect of that, the history of that character, it was great. We shot it very quickly. We shot 24 days. So it was uh, 4 6-day weeks in Florida, in Orlando. And it was the first movie shot on the lot at the new Orlando Universal Studios back in 1990. And it was fantastic. It was difficult, but it was contained. You know, Critters 2 and The Stand were all over outside, every kind of weather you can imagine. Mostly we were on sound stages on Psycho 4, and it was out of town, so that was exciting. I think it might have been my first location shoot outside of LA. And it was a great education working with my first movie star, with Tony Perkins. And as complicated as that might have been sometimes, I'm so grateful for the experience of learning from somebody who had been directed by Alfred Hitchcock and Orson Welles and William Wyler and all these great prime time Hollywood golden era filmmakers. You know.
Yeah, and you, one of the projects you've been tied to that is, I assume, probably the most commercially successful ever, probably Hocus Pocus, which came out when I was a kid, is loved by everybody. And then just recently, was it last year, maybe the year before, they
It
had the
was
sequel.
last September. Yeah.
Yeah, with the amazing Bette Midler. I mean,
Yep.
what was that like? I mean, to see, number one, how did that project come to be? And the fact that you're writing, I mean, obviously the whole cast is great, but the fact that you're writing for someone as amazing as Bette Midler, that's got to be so satisfying.
Well, it was amazing. There were 11 writers on it after me, and then it kind of went back. I wrote my script 8 years before the movie was shot. So
Wow.
I wasn't writing for Bette Midler. I was writing for Winifred Sanderson. But to see, and I wasn't the director on it, but I was the first writer. It was an idea by the producer, David Kirshner, who's brilliant, an excellent painter and artist. He created the story for his daughters and wrote the story for the Muppet magazine at the time. And so again, because I was working for Spielberg, Disney wanted that kind of attitude for this. And David Kirshner had created An American Tail, the animated movie for Amblin, that was kind of competitive with what Disney did. So David sold it to Disney. David liked my work on Amazing Stories and what I was doing at Amblin. And so the two of us together made a great team. I was the first writer. I wrote the first few drafts and really created all the characters and situations, and Billy Butcherson and the sisters and the kids and all of that stuff. And I went back to Salem, Massachusetts to scout, to inspire me to learn a lot about the history of that area where it took place, and went back there 6 years in a row just because Halloween in Salem is so amazing. And the experience was fantastic, but we never thought it would get made. 8 years later, I got a phone call saying Bette Midler was interested in making the movie. This was at the height of her career, starring in comedies, and thought, oh my God, she's never going to do this. And once she got attached, everything went like the green light was very, very active. And I watched from a distance. I got to visit the set the first day of shooting, and everyone was great. It was great to meet everyone, but I was not involved during the production. But I was just lucky enough to have been able to write the foundational screenplays for that movie.
Yeah, I saw her on Broadway in Hello, Dolly.
Oh,
Probably the
wow.
greatest musical I've ever seen. The crowd was
Wow.
electric. It was like being at a rock show, but a musical. It was incredible. Did you have any opportunity, or were you approached at all when it came to the sequel to contribute to that in some way?
No, they wanted a female writer and a female director. It was, and that's the right thing. I thought they played it a little more safely than we did, but it turned out well, and I think it was the right thing.
Yeah.
I trod that ground already.
The postmortem TV show. Obviously, I'm interviewing you now, but you have a ton of experience interviewing people. And what was that like for you, the postmortem TV show, to do that and interview all these amazing people, and then kind of the evolution of that later on into what you're doing now with the podcast?
Well, I started interviewing as a teenager. I interviewed Rod Serling and Ray Bradbury when I was 15, 16 years old. So I did that and interviewed musicians when I was doing music. I wrote for the San Diego Door at the same time Cameron Crowe was. He was 15, I was 17. And then my first interview show on television was on the Z Channel back in 1978 through 1980. So it was the idea of Peter Block, who was running FearNet at the time, to do that. And so that was 2010, when FearNet was just becoming an on the air or cable. You could get it on cable, and rather than just online. And so we did 10 of them, and it was so great. I had so much fun because I hadn't flexed those muscles in a long time. And I interview people because I learn from this. Every interview I've done including the over 165 of them we've done on postmortem, I learned something, even from first-time directors. It keeps me up to date. It keeps me evolving, and involved in a genre that's important to me, that is still a big part of my life. So, as you probably know, nobody gets rich doing a podcast. And if you don't love it, it's not for you. And I just love being able to talk to people who I admire and I respect and can learn from, and just see where they come from and how they do it. Yeah.
And you mentioned Ray Bradbury. I mean, how young were you when you interviewed him, and what was it like to talk to such a legend?
I was 16. He was my favorite writer. I knew so much about him. And this was in the days where there weren't that many geeks around who knew the background and history of science fiction and horror authors and the like. It was fantastic. He did a speaking engagement at the local junior college. I was 16, I think. And I was in the audience, and I'd arranged with the college to do an interview with him afterwards. Nobody else was interviewing him, just this 16-year-old kid for the high school newspaper. And so there was a table set up on the stage after everyone left, and I took a chair opposite him, and we talked. And he was amazing. First of all, he spoke like an evangelist when he gave his presentations. He was just a wonderful, wonderful fire and brimstone kind of speaker, and so passionate about his craft and about the work and about the future. And so he was talking about, I sing the body electric. And I said, now I remember on Twilight Zone, I, Tom, and my electric grand. And he said, suddenly he knew I loved and understood his work, and everything turned a corner then. He was not giving canned answers or anything, but he understood that I was there because I was passionate about his work, and I knew his work. And just knowing that he'd done this Twilight Zone in 1959, just kind of unlocked the interview in a way. And it was one of the first interviews I'd ever done, and it made me realize I really enjoy doing this. And I seem to be able to get people to open up in ways that they don't always open up, particularly with postmortem, because I'm a filmmaker interviewing filmmakers, and always give them a comfortable place and let them know that it's only going to be a positive experience. We're not going to talk about anything they're uncomfortable talking about unless they want to. And we've had people open up on the show. Well, you heard Jamie Lee. She breaks down into tears talking about ending her life as Laurie Strode. And we've had that happen with probably a half a dozen of our interviews, where I don't think I drive them to tears, but allow them the space to feel comfortable to get emotional.
And you have a great voice too. So I think when people listen,
I don't know about that.
You have a really warm voice, almost like when I think of a singer with a warm voice, Rod Stewart. Or everything that he sings, it's comforting. And I think that with podcasts, because it's so close to your head, right? You're literally just like sometimes listening to it with headphones. It's almost like your listeners form a relationship with you without really knowing you. I think it's such an intimate experience. And I'm sure you've met many of your listeners over the years where they feel like they know you, even though it might be the first time they're meeting you.
Well, I do get that. And it's the greatest compliment an interviewer could possibly have. But, I like to be open and make the guests feel open. And so I would perhaps that goes over into the listeners feeling that same thing, because I want to be a welcoming presence to the guests, and therefore by osmosis, maybe that happens with the listeners. But thank you. That's a great compliment.
Yeah, and I swear these are the last three things I want to ask you about.
Okay.
It's just been such a great conversation. So you mentioned Tales from the Crypt earlier, and I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring that up. So Freddy's Nightmares led into Tales from the Crypt. That's another iconic franchise that has just continued. What was it like having that opportunity to work on Tales from the Crypt?
It was really great. I really had a good time. And again, you're right, another icon with the Crypt Keeper, Norman Bates and the Crypt Keeper and the critters and so many iconic creatures and the like. But it was a lot of fun. And again, that one was a comedy. It kind of devolved into the Boobs and Blood show, but this one, yes, we had boobs and blood in it, but we also had Rita Rudner and Richard Lewis as the stars. And it was a very specific choice for me to hire comedians rather than dramatic actors to play those parts. Playing dramatic parts, but they can't help but bring a sense of humor to it. And the exaggerated style that Tales from the Crypt has encourages you to reach for something cinematic and something that is not just standard coverage, but to do a real exaggerated comic book style. And I had so much fun just working with that cast and crew. It really was freeing and enjoyable. And it was really fun. At the time, the LA Weekly said, "Oh, this coming after The Stand, Mick Garris is my favorite television director." And I was like, really? I've never heard that before or since, but
That's one of the major projects that you helped co-write was The Fly, Jeff Goldblum. Was that similar to Hocus
no,
Pocus?
The Fly too.
Oh, The Fly too. Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
But was that similar to Hocus Pocus in that you wrote it years prior, or did you write it and then boom, it went into production?
I came into Fly too. Now, The Fly was written by David Cronenberg and Norman, I forget his last name. Fly 2 came along. I was the first writer hired, and I had a very adventurous idea for the storyline that had to do with right to life and abortion or not to abort the Brundlefly and all of that. And I started writing that version, and then they changed presidents of the studio, and they wanted to turn it into a teenage monster movie. So all of this great topical stuff that I was trying to write as an adult, like Cronenberg did with the original Fly, which I think is a masterpiece, a great film. The Fly 2 is not a masterpiece in anybody's eyes, but all of the things that made it great, all the humanity, all of the scientific intelligence, all of the social commentary that I tried to replicate in Fly 2, the studio didn't want that. The new regime running the studio. The producer originally, he was all for it. Stuart Kornfeld, and Mel Brooks was the head of the production company, Brooks Films. So I got to meet with Mel a couple of times, which was an amazingly wonderful experience. But it was really frustrating. And when I was offered Critters 2 as a director, I was able to leave with my head held high and say, sayonara. And then Frank Darabont was the next writer. And then the Jim and Ken Wheat did the final shooting draft.
And for folks who aren't aware of this, I mean, obviously you've done movies, TV shows, but you also are an author. So you have a ton of books out there that you've written. Share with people, what kind of books do you write, and how does that compare to writing for TV or film?
Well, it's incredibly freeing because you don't think about egos, you don't think about budgets, you don't think about making your days, you don't think about visual effects or what anything costs. And it's also much more internal than writing movies. You can write more about the human condition, what's going on, what's psychologically motivating relationships, and all those things. So I usually would write a short story after I would write or direct a movie or TV show, just for the joy of writing words to the page. And I'm very playful with my word choice. And, I know grammar well enough to use it incorrectly when I want. And so it's recreational for me to write fiction. And I've written a couple of novels. My most recent is a collection of 4 novellas and a short novel called These Evil Things We Do, which is available from Encyclopocalypse, which is a mouthful of a publisher, but it's available through Amazon. My first novel was Development Hell, which was based on a short story I'd written called A Life in the Cinema. That was the name of my first collection. Then I wrote a sequel story to that, and then a third story, and I showed it to Stephen King, and he said, this is sort of like a loose novel. And the cartoon light bulb went off over my head, and I went back from the beginning and turned it into my first novel, Development Hell. So there are some novellas out there, but probably the best, those are the three that stand alone. I've done novellas that have been published separately, and I've written stories for collections, but kind of one subgenre that I've created and monopolized is the Hollywood horror story. And so often they take place within the world of filmmaking, and often a filmmaker who is on his way down, because I like to take the absolute worst things about my life or my personality, amplify them times 1,000, and put them into print. So that's kind of my way of writing fiction.
And have you considered narrating an audiobook? Because I feel like that'd be perfect for you.
I've never thought of myself as a good reader for an audiobook, but on my interview website, mickgarrisinterviews.com, a few of my short stories have been recorded, a couple of them by me, 2 of them by Steven Weber, 2 of them by Matt Frewer, and 1 of them by the late, great Miguel Ferrer. So all of those are available for free to listen to access, to download, as well as most of my Z Channel interviews. The postmortem TV shows are all there, and my making ofs and things like that. A lot of stuff is there, including the audiobooks of these short stories. So it's a wealth of Mick Garris information. So.
Right, and then for those who want to watch Masters of Horror, I believe that right now it's on Screenbox. So for anyone who wants to check that, which is great. And then what brought us here today is Master of Horror, the official biography of Mick Garris by Abby Bernstein, forward by John Landis. And what are your thoughts on this book? And I'm curious, it was written by Abby. Did you ever consider writing an autobiography, or no? And like, how did this come together?
I don't have a big enough ego to write an autobiography, and I've never intended that. And I've had a couple of people ask me if they could write a biography of me, and I've always said, my mother's dead, who's going to buy it? I just can't imagine there being an audience for that. And Abby was quite persistent, and I've known Abby for 40 years, and she's a wonderful person. I think she did an amazing job on it. She made me look interesting. And but she was persistent, and I said, okay, if you get a publisher willing to do that, then I'd be happy to cooperate. Thinking like Hocus Pocus, this is never going to get made. And then Abby came to me and said, we got a publisher who not only wants to do this book, but is excited to do this book. And so I said, okay, I promised, and we did it. And she really did a good job reaching out to family and friends, my old bandmates, people I've worked with in movies and television, and my sisters and my friends, my wife, everybody. So, and she put it into a chronological order that makes a lot of sense, taking it beyond my early life. Then it starts going chapter by chapter, each of the projects that I wrote or directed. And I just couldn't believe that I was reading an entertaining book about me, and she did a great job.
Yeah, it's really excellent. Anyone who doesn't own this, you can get it at ATB Publishing. They put this book out there, and it's very excellent. And there's also lots of great photos in here as well, just kind of chronicling your life and your career. And we've done,
which is
quite
so
a bit
weird to me. It's a bizarre feeling to have somebody write a book about you, I'm here to tell you.
Yeah, no. What's it's like some people say when they get a lifetime achievement award, they're like, "I'm not done yet. Why am I getting this award now?"
Exactly. Exactly. So
Yeah. Well, no, this has been a
hopefully.
delight. And so for anyone who wants to keep up with you and your projects and things you're working on, where can they follow you?
Mick Garris PM is on Twitter and Instagram, and Postmortem with Mick Garris, or just Mick Garris on Facebook. I'm out there. My podcast producer mostly handles the Instagram and Twitter, but I check in all the time. So, and usually if something's going on, when I'm ready to announce it, it'll be out there. And so I hope we're approaching that time now on this new project I'm working on.
Oh, is this the Clive one or something different?
Something different.
Oh, okay. So we'll have to stay tuned for that. Well, thank you, Mick. This has been a delight. Yeah, it's just been an honor speaking with you, and I'm glad that we can make this happen.
I'm glad we finally did it, Michael. Thanks for your persistence.
Thank you.
Take care.